Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us on what is a very foggy and miserable day in Washington and a very late evening in Sydney for our guest, Ben Bland. So we are going to talk to Ben today about his new book, first English language biography of President Joko Widodo, Jokowi of Indonesia, called Man of Contradictions. Before we get started, let me put a little housekeeping up at the top. So this is going to be an on-the-record event. We will be recording and then get the video posted to YouTube and to the CSIS webpage in a day or so. If you have any questions for Ben, please write them into the Q&A function and we'll go ahead and read them. And we're just going to have an armchair discussion between the two of us for 15 or 20 minutes and give you time to get those questions in. The event today is made possible by general support to the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS. And with that, let's jump into our quick introductions and then start our conversation. So I am Greg Polton. I'm a senior fellow for Southeast Asia here at CSIS. And more importantly, my guest is Ben Bland. Ben runs the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. He was previously an acclaimed journalist with the FT based in Hanoi, Hong Kong, and most importantly for these purposes, Jakarta, which is where Ben and I first met probably almost 10 years ago now, 8-9 years ago. Ben's previous book on Hong Kong was called Generation HK, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow. And now his second book is what brings us here today. So Ben, thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you, Greg.
So I thought we would just start with a bit of background, the meta-narrative, right? What is it about Jokowi that you found so interesting that you wanted to write a book about him?
Well, like all these things, a lot of it came down to luck and timing. So yeah, I was a journalist, foreign correspondent previously, but I'd studied Southeast Asian history. I'd traveled and lived in Southeast Asia before when I was a late teenager. And I was an FT correspondent. I'd been in Vietnam, and in 2012, my bosses asked me to move to Indonesia, which I was really excited to do. And I landed in Jakarta in the midst of this hotly fought election campaign for the governorship of Jakarta. And at that time, Joko Widodo, known as Jokowi, who was the mayor of Solo or Surakarta, his home city, was running for the governorship of Jakarta as this outside candidate. He was attracting a lot of excitement. He was really kind of the new face, promising to do things very differently. And there was a lot of expectation. So as I followed him around the city, I went to his campaign rallies. I got to talk to him a few times. I was just fascinated by this guy who really electrified Indonesian politics without saying much. He really had a simple background as a furniture maker, a furniture exporter, mayor of his hometown. And there were these great hopes that he could clean up the corrupt politics of Jakarta, stop the floods, deal with the traffic jams. But when you saw Jokowi himself speak, he just said, I'm a simple guy, I'll go to the ground, I'll fix problems. So I was just fascinated in his ability to captivate the imagination of the nation in what's probably the most important of the many directly elected positions in Indonesia. And then I was lucky enough to see his rise, really. So from mayor of Solo, when I first saw him, to the presidency within just 2 years. I was lucky enough to interview him a number of times and meet many of his advisors and those around him. And was just fascinated by this guy who came from nowhere, made it to the top so quickly, and sort of promised so much. But then, as we've seen in office, he's come up against the harsh realities of trying to run and reform this vast, complex democracy that is Indonesia.
So let's pull at that a little bit, right? Because the story of Jokowi circa 2014 was really interesting, right? He was one of several young-ish mayors around Indonesia who were seen as kind of a less beholden to the party, independent, technocratic, new generation. And then he carried that almost myth-making with him as governor of Jakarta. What's the biggest change you've seen between the image we had of Jokowi in 2014 during his first run and the Jokowi we see now in 2020?
Well, I remember thinking when he was running for the presidency for the first time that actually this image of him as this technocratic, transformative reformer was really quite disconnected from who he really was, because I saw him as a really straightforward, practical guy, this hands-on man who was literally hands-on building wooden furniture, then hands-on fixing the problems in his home city. Then in Jakarta, he famously jumped into the drains to look at what was blocking them, and that was the way he did things. And he didn't really have a big vision. He said, "I'll go and talk to people. I'll fix these problems." And yet, if you talk to analysts outside the country and also to some people in civil society in Indonesia, they had this great hope that because he was an outsider by background, as you say, he was a member of PDIP, one of the big parties, but he wasn't really part of the party elite. In fact, he was to become the first president from outside the elite. So Jokowi, without saying much, allowed people to paint their hopes and dreams onto him quite smartly, but without ever really committing to much. So I think that allowed these expectations to grow and grow and grow. And I think as he spent more time in office, we've seen the realities emerge. So the guy who was the great outsider, the first president in Indonesia outside the political elite, outside the military elite and the religious establishment, etc., he's now been launching his own political dynasty effectively, with his son and son-in-law running in local elections later this year. He's also, I think, changed quite a bit in terms of the sort of leader he is. He's definitely become more firm, more stubborn, and more impulsive in a sense. But I think it's more a question, rather than sort of power corrupting, as they say, it's more a question for me of power revealing. That Jokowi was always quite a cautious, small c conservative politician who, yes, he had this amazing connection with the people because of his humble background, but he also always worked with the established elites in Solo, in Jakarta, and then when he became president. And we've seen him amass, growing power, really. So when he was first elected, he had around 40% of Indonesia's parliament backing his very loose coalition. Now that's 3/4, 75% pretty much of the parliament are behind him. So as he's amassed this power, I think he's become more stubborn in a sense, more impulsive, but he hasn't necessarily been able to translate this broad coalition into effective policy making, because one of the problems we see in Indonesian politics, and there's a similarity here with his predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, is that you can build a big tent coalition, but it becomes very unwieldy to manage that coalition. So you often spend as much time fighting internally as you do externally.
That's, it's interesting the way you frame them. And I do remember 2013, 2014, Jokowi was basically a brand on which people would project whatever they wanted. So what most people seem to know about Jokowi is that he liked to wear checkered shirts and that they had made a video game about him during the election run. And anything uncomfortable that had to be done as mayor or as governor, they let, a Hulk go ahead and take the hits. And so Jokowi was this empty shell. And during the presidential run, he was basically just the anti-Prabowo. And governing is very different than running as, a checkered shirt that's not Prabowo. So you talked about his moves towards establishing his own political dynasty, which again clashes with the idea we once had outside of Indonesia of Jokowi. At the same time, he hasn't followed the Yudhoyono path of setting up his own party. He doesn't really have a political vehicle, right? He's still, within PDIP at least, he still appears to be subservient to Megawati. So what do you think the long-lasting effects, if any, on Indonesian politics are going to be of the Jokowi administration? Or is he a flash in the pan because he hasn't institutionalized himself in that way?
Well, I just find Jokowi this very confounding figure in many ways. And the more I spoke to the people around him, I think they had a similar feeling that it's quite hard to grasp what he's really about, what really drives him in a sense. And he's often been painted, particularly by his opponents in the past, by Prabowo, now his friend, formerly his opponent and his friend and backer before that. But anyway, he was painted by Prabowo as a boneka, a puppet of Megawati. But actually, Jokowi in many ways pulled the presidency from under the feet of Megawati and certainly her daughter. And, he's had this uneasy relationship with her where sometimes he shows her deference and he's criticized for that. Other times he seems to defy her and push back against her. So it's quite hard to know where he stands. I think often when you think he looks weak, he does things that appear strong. And when he seems in a very strong political position, he sometimes does things that seem very weak. So it's quite confounding to get a grasp. But I think one thing I'd say, he is an incremental leader. He is quite cautious. So after the 2014 election, when he was really carried to power by these very enthusiastic volunteers on the ground who were campaigning for him because Megawati's party, which had raised a lot of money because of Jokowi, wanted to keep it for itself. They didn't really want to spend it on him. So it was the volunteers who swept him into power. And some of those guys said, let's form our own Jokowi party, which is kind of the standard thing you do in Indonesian politics. A lot of the parties are vehicles for the personal ambitions of individuals. But he wasn't really willing to do that, to stand so openly against Megawati and take such a strong step. So now, as I said, his son and son-in-law are moving into politics under the PDIP banner, but it doesn't really put him in a strong position because it's not his party in a sense. And even for SBY, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, he obviously had his own party. He has two sons in politics. He has great ambitions for. He hasn't really been able to maneuver that much influence, actually, since he left office. So I think it's quite hard in Indonesia, actually, to plan your legacy, to plan your path ahead, because there is a lot of money politics. There are powerful dynasties, but there's also a lot of contestation. And the fact is the elections are free and fair and really hotly contested. And that means that however much the elites try, they can't sew up everything. You can't make your son into a successful politician if they're a political dud at the end of the day, because parties want to back someone who's going to win votes.
Which is the same criticism that Megawati gets for trying to appoint Puan as leader, despite her lack of popular support. So one of the confounding things for not just the U.S., but I think for most international observers, has been trying to get a handle on what Jokowi foreign policy is. And so Jokowi has very much been focused on his infrastructure push, on domestic, social, and economic concerns. And maybe we were all spoiled by the Yudhoyono years, right? The idea of Indonesia as a really active international player. How do you see Jokowi's foreign policy, and particularly the balance he struck between China and the U.S., and is that likely to continue after his administration?
Well, I'd say three things here, okay? Firstly, I think whoever's been president in recent times in Indonesia has been constrained by this fundamental foreign policy stance that Indonesia has of what they call being independent and active, but really it's about, I guess, being non-aligned, maintaining strategic autonomy. So I think that constraint was there for SBY as well. Certainly, he talked a good game, and he had foreign ministers in Martin Natalegawa and Hassan Wurayuda who were a bit more active, but I think there were still limits to that. So SBY gave good speeches and was interested in sort of projecting himself as an international figure, but he wasn't necessarily that much more active. So those constraints have been there. That's the first thing I'd say. Secondly, within that, Jokowi has taken a slightly different, sort of more, I guess, unilateral and instinctive approach, but ultimately he really sees foreign policy as a way to drive economic growth at home. As a former furniture exporter and a city mayor, he's really all about driving economic growth. In that, he's very much in line with what Indonesians want from their foreign policy and from their foreign government. So the best way to explain this slight shift in emphasis is SBY famously used to talk about having 1,000 friends and no enemies, sometimes 1,000,000 friends and no enemies when he was feeling very friendly. And Jokowi, not long after he came to power, I think on his first overseas trip to the East Asia Summit in Naypyidaw in 2014, on the flight back, he was asked by Indonesian journalists about SBY's point of view. And Jokowi said something along the lines of, what's the point of having all these friends if we don't get any benefits? So friends with benefits, that's what Jokowi's all about. He wants the most benefits for Indonesia, chiefly investment and trading opportunities with the fewest conditions. So you might call it mercantilist, I guess, but it's quite a pragmatic approach. And so lastly, how does that relate to China and the US? I think Jokowi, above all, wants investment. He wants trade. So he's willing to play with whoever's going to bring money and other benefits to the table. Obviously, China has been a big source of investment into Indonesia, particularly a lot of support for Indonesia's plans to upgrade its minerals processing industries. So a lot of money has been flowing in there. Indonesia also sees opportunities to bring in Chinese SOEs and infrastructure for things like the high-speed rail project, now underway slowly between Jakarta and Bandung, which would be the first, I think, successful export of China's high-speed rail technology. But at the same time, obviously, Jokowi understands, the tensions with China over maritime issues. Indonesia does have this overlap between its exclusive economic zone and China's 9-dash line, and that tensions there have flared up a few times in the last few years. So at those moments, Jokowi, I think, has to show this firm rhetorical line to maintain support at home, to show that he's willing to defend the sovereignty of the unitary Indonesian Republic. So he is willing to push back. And broadly, he's kept the settings of relatively close cooperation for the Indonesian military with the US, with Australia and other US alliance partners, but within the limits of no alliances. And as we've seen recently, no P-8 planes allowed to refuel and land in Indonesia. So it is this delicate balance. China is good for investment, but Indonesia is not so keen to go down the route of military cooperation with the PLA. If you look at the number of exercises and cooperation, the extent of cooperation they have there. So it's quite a complex picture. And sometimes, there are things that confound people. So for example, a great example is that communism is actually illegal in Indonesia, not just to launch a party, but even to promote communism or Leninism, Marxism as a result of Indonesia's painful history of the really bloody massacres of leftists in the 1960s that saw Suharto rise to power. But at the same time, Indonesia and Indonesian leaders, including the military, are actually quite sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party's crackdown on the Uyghurs, because they see it more as a sort of internal security threat and a need to support a fellow developing Asian country in keeping outside interference in domestic affairs away. So, it's quite a complex picture. And so it doesn't really fit easily in terms of, I think some of the views from Washington we would hear these days of this ideological battle, because on the one hand, yes, Indonesia is against communism. On the other hand, Indonesia is quite in line with the Chinese Communist Party's view of keeping outside interference at bay. At the same time, they do have this tension in the South China Sea, but Indonesia, just lastly, is lucky and being much further away from China than the Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Malaysia. So it doesn't have the same extent of border disputes or maritime disputes as those others, which gives Jokowi a bit more leeway, I think, to attract Chinese investment without too many problems.
So let me ask you one more question, then we'll go to our queue. So you were wrapping up your manuscript just as the first cases were hitting in the spring, COVID-19. So as you watch now, the book already sent off to the publisher and nothing you can do about it. What do you make of Jokowi's response and the government's response? Did it amplify for you the trends that you had already thought you identified in Jokowi? And what do you think it's going to do for the rest of his remaining term in office?
I think, unfortunately, we have seen some of the weaknesses that I'd highlighted in my book in his leadership and in his government emerge during the COVID-19 crisis. So, some leaders in the world have clearly risen to the challenge, but I think Jokowi we've seen previously as someone who tends to get knocked off his feet by crises. He's not someone who thrives in unfamiliar settings. And I think we've seen a number of issues emerge which were there beforehand. So I think a lack of trust or a lack of willingness to listen to expertise. Jokowi is really an instinctive and an impulsive politician. He's not interested, to be fair, like a lot of leaders, in long-winded, complex explanations, but that I think makes it difficult tackling a pandemic with its complex effects on health and the economy. I think that's one issue we've seen. Another big challenge is that Jokowi rules through personalities, not processes. So it's all about which ministers he's getting on with at the moment, and he looks to them to get things done. But again, I think that came to be a limitation on his infrastructure push because there wasn't enough thought into what were the most productive projects to push ahead. And again, if we look at who he's turning to resolve the pandemic crisis. It's the Minister of State-Owned Enterprises, Eric Thohir. It's the Minister for Maritime Affairs, Luhut Pandjaitan, a former general who was also a former business partner of Jokowi, and the head of the military. So he's really looking to the people he has a close relationship with. But you have to question if that's an effective way to manage a pandemic in such a big country. And another couple of issues I think we've seen is this kind of knee-jerk reliance on the police and the military to, quote unquote, get things done. Jokowi was already doing this for issues as diverse as, improving coal production and rice production to the distribution of fertilizer. He was looking to the military as one of the institutions that he felt could have boots on the ground, could be effective when so much of the rest of the Indonesian bureaucracy is mired in red tape. It spends a lot of time fighting internally. So he's looked to the military, he's looked to the police to get things done, but obviously they have a very securitized approach, which tends to involve withholding information from the public. We've seen the police prosecuting a lot of government critics, even during the pandemic. So that reflects this other element, which I think is, despite Jokowi being kind of the hero of civil society back in the day, his government's actually shown a lack of trust in civil society. There are a number of quite innovative initiatives from Indonesian civil society to use digital data to monitor the extent of the pandemic. A lot of communities have done their own efforts to have lockdowns or some kind of local quarantines. But his government has really shown a lack of interest, I think, in engaging with those initiatives and a much more high-handed, knee-jerk approach. And I think this reflects a wider political issue that, although it's 22 years now since the fall of Suharto, a lot of those authoritarian guide ropes in Indonesia are still there, both in terms of kind of the mindset and the institutions and many of the individuals too. So I think there's this knee-jerk feeling that when they're under pressure, whether it's the mass Islamist campaign to oust Ahok, Jokowi's former deputy and then the governor of Jakarta, or it's COVID-19, there's this sort of instinctive look to the military, to securitization, to controlling information, locking up critics. And if you look around Jokowi, he's surrounded by these former and current police and military generals in many, many key positions. And I don't think this necessarily reflects a desire from him to willfully push back the reforms that took the military out of politics, or necessarily does it reflect an overwhelming sort of plot from the military to take control again. But I think it's just Jokowi's instinctive nature. He's in a crisis. Who can get things done? These guys can. But I do think it's worrying for Indonesia's democratic development because, we still see these same figures having so much influence and the same mindset. And democracy has come a long way in Indonesia. I said the elections are really, really fair, really well run. But you have to be a bit concerned about the quality of democracy in Indonesia and democratic practice, which is a great irony or contradiction because Jokowi used Indonesia's democratization more successfully than anyone else to go from being a furniture manufacturer in a city of 500,000 people to the presidency. Without those free and fair elections, without his outsider status, he wouldn't have been able to get to the top. But once he's been in the top, he hasn't been a great guardian of democracy.
Thanks. All right, let's move to audience Q&A. And to remind everybody, if you ask a question in the Q&A function, please go ahead and identify yourself so Ben knows who's yelling at him and can accurately defend himself. Let's give Alex Arafianto at RSIS the first question because it pulls at those threads you were just touching on regarding the military and democratic backsliding. So Alex asks, what do you think is causing the rising influence of the TNI, the military and the police within Jokowi's administration? It certainly predates COVID-19. And do you think the democratic backsliding that many identify is a result of that military influence, or are they an effect of democratic backsliding?
Well, I have to say, I don't really like the idea of democratic backsliding as a trend. I mean, I think it as a description of what's happening, it's okay. But, a lot of people tend to lump in what's going on in Indonesia with what's going on in the US, with what's going on in Brazil or the Philippines or the rest of Southeast Asia. But I don't see it that way. I think it's better to understand it in the context of Indonesia's history and this push and pull between democracy and authoritarianism that goes back to Indonesia's founding in 1945. It's a country that's just 75 years young, formed out of the arbitrary limits of Dutch colonial expansion. And Indonesia's only had two very short experiments with democracy, so briefly in the 1950s, and then in the 22 years since the fall of Suharto. So I don't see it as this sort of deliberate pushback or part of a global trend. I think it's more, Indonesia, after Reformasi, certain things changed. Free and fair elections were brought in. There was this big bang decentralization of power. But many of the authoritarian figures from that era, not least Prabowo, now the defense minister, potentially a presidential candidate in future, former son-in-law of Suharto, but many other figures from the military and from the bureaucracy stayed in power. Many of the institutions stayed in power, and the mindset. And even if you look at Jokowi himself, when I interviewed him and I asked him what democracy meant to him, he said democracy is about improving the lives of the people. So he had this very functional idea of what it is. It wasn't necessarily about accountability and transparency and checks and balances. And we saw that. So after Jokowi appointed Prabowo to his cabinet, having twice defeated him in these really bitterly fought, quite nasty election campaigns. I was on the ground for both. A lot of Jokowi's strongest supporters were bitterly disappointed, and he just dismissed them out of hand, saying, well, in Indonesia, we don't have Western-style liberal democracy. We have gotong royong, cooperative democracy, where there is no opposition. That's not the way we do things. And you might say he's just using a throwaway line to defend what he's done. But it does play into this historical debate that Indonesia has had going back to the founding, where there was an explicit rejection of kind of the Western liberal economic values and liberal democratic values, partly because they were seeing as being tainted by what the Dutch had done into Indonesia. So I think it's better to understand it in the context of Indonesia's history, and to understand that, as many people would say now in the States as well, right? A democracy isn't just a destination. It's not somewhere you get to and then everything works. It's something you constantly have to work at. So I think there's been pressure in the last few years, but if you look at the longer picture, Indonesia hasn't done a bad job on this front. But it has been concerning in the last few years. And if you're a civil society activist in Indonesia, it's really a difficult time now. And I think one thing that we've seen is that civil society in Indonesia, while it's very noisy and broad, it's actually quite thin. So there aren't as many people involved as you'd think. They don't really have the institutional or financial roots. And so that is quite concerning, not least because quite a few governments have been withdrawing funding donors have been withdrawing funding from Indonesia because there was a sense that democracy has succeeded in Indonesia. But at the end, I don't think these problems can really be solved from the outside. It's for Indonesians to resolve, and Indonesian civil society will have to fight on and find ways to push back and to deepen their roots and public support.
Let's talk about a few of the personalities around Jokowi. So you mentioned Prabowo. We have a question from Stanley Harsha. Did Prabowo's appointment to defense minister and also his rehabilitation internationally now with his visit to Washington, does that increase his chances, or I suppose Gurindra's chances, if he doesn't run in the next election? What does that mean for Indonesian governance going forward?
Well, Prabowo is a very determined man. He's now run for the presidency or vice presidency in different guises and lost 4 times. But he's now been appointed defense minister of the world's 4th biggest country. It's the first time he's been serving the nation since he was sacked from the military in ignominy in 1998 and went into self-exile. So it's really a remarkable comeback. But Indonesian politics just has that circular nature where, you can go into disgrace or you can be thrown in jail like Ahok, then you can come back in a new guise and things can move on. So I would imagine Prabowo is someone who's deeply ambitious. He talks about, he told me, in fact, he wasn't born to rule, but he was born to serve. And he definitely has this sense of destiny, of fate, given his family's role and connections to the struggle for independence in Indonesia. And how much money and time he's spent building his political party and his position in Indonesia. I think, he has to be one of the potential contenders. But 4 years is a long way away in Indonesian politics, so it's quite hard to predict. And as for Prabowo's rehabilitation, I think it was inevitable, frankly, once he's defense minister, that the US, I'm sure later Australia and any other country was always going to allow him to visit. If he'd won the presidential election in 2014 or 19, it would have been exactly the same. But it does tell us something about kind of what I was alluding to earlier, the fact that these figures from the Suharto era are still so influential 22 years on. And it is a bit depressing in a sense, because as you were asking earlier, Greg, there was this hope that Jokowi would represent this new wave of leaders coming in from outside the established elite who would shake things up, who would take power away and basically push reformasi reform into a new phase. But that hasn't really happened. And Jokowi has gone from being this outsider to being a consummate elite politician playing in this game. I mean, the only thing I'd say, though, is that, again, because of Indonesia's free and fair elections, the elites can't afford to just put up a dud. And Prabowo, to be fair, is someone who's won a lot of public support in 2 Indonesian elections. He didn't win, but he did win a lot of support. And so it comes down to what Indonesian voters want in 2024. They'll be the ones who decide. And I don't think it's going to be as easy as some people think to just pull one over on them.
Let's talk about the other former senior general. So Ricky Ramon asked, what do you think about Luhut bin Sarpanjaitan? Many Indonesians consider him to have even more power than Jokowi. I suspect he would push back on that. Many believe that he stood in the way of certain reform agendas. Maybe you would or wouldn't push back on that. And maybe you can talk a little bit, because I'm sure most people on the call know who Luhut is, but some might not be all that familiar with his relationship with Jokowi, right? Why has he been at Jokowi's right hand for the entire 2 administrations so far?
Well, I think the important context to understand here is Jokowi rose from basically total obscurity to the presidency so quickly. So it was just 9 years from him running a small furniture factory in a city of 500,000 people. I think it would be, I don't know what the equivalent would be, but someone running like a metal factory in Pittsburgh or something, to the presidency of Indonesia in just 9 years. Right. And in fact, it was just 2 years really from him being mayor of Solo to him being president. So he rose so quickly. I think when he came to power in Jakarta, he didn't really trust or know many people. And he was someone from the provinces. So again, I don't think he was that comfortable hanging around the Jakarta elite. And Luhut Pandjaitan, another former general, was someone who he did know from his business. So I think Luhut first invested in Jokowi's furniture business in, I think, the mid-2000s. Luhut, like a lot of former generals, had amassed business interests in the extractive industries. So he had a timber plantation and Jokowi had the furniture factory. So yeah, they'd been co-investors. And at that time, Jokowi was already kind of getting into politics, starting to attract quite a lot of attention nationally in Solo because of the way he was doing things differently. And he had this amazing connection with voters, this brilliant talent, I think, for retail politics. So I think Luhut saw that Jokowi could go somewhere. He backed him. And as someone Jokowi's known, for the longest time of these elite figures, he's ended up being quite influential. So while he has this very odd job title, the coordinating minister for maritime affairs, he is in a sense the closest thing Jokowi has to a prime minister or a real vice president. And this is one of the great kind of conundrums of Indonesian politics under Jokowi, that if you were to look at the official org chart, you wouldn't have a bloody clue who's really in power, because the vice president, Maruf Amin, this aging conservative cleric, is basically invisible. Jokowi even forgot his name in a recent cabinet meeting. And Luhut, who's meant to be dealing with maritime affairs, is in charge of everything from managing investments with China, managing COVID-19, managing Jared Kushner, all sorts of stuff. But the thing is with Jokowi, he's unpredictable. He likes to keep people on their toes. I think he's appointed a number of mavericks in the past, but he does tend to dispense with them after a while. And he likes to kind of sit above the cabinet. We've seen this pushback recently against his Omnibus Law, this new bill that's meant to transform the economic prospects in Indonesia. And I think just yesterday he said, it's not my fault, it's the cabinet. They're not very good at communicating. He said the same thing about COVID-19. So he likes to sit above his ministers and let them fight it out. So Luhut looks to be in a very strong position now. And he's probably the only one who's had kind of ever increasing power. But you've seen the other people around him, their influence has really waxed and waned. And you never really know who speaks for Jokowi. It's very hard with SBY. There were clear people who were always with him. They could tell you what SBY was thinking, and they could pass a message to him. Jokowi is much more mercurial in the way he manages his cabinet. And I think it's a deliberate kind of instinctive strategy to protect himself politically and be willing to sacrifice, ministers who screw up sometimes, but not all the time. And you just never quite know what he's going to do.
So you're doing a very good job of giving me segues into questions that are already in the queues. It's making it much more organic than these.
I'm not reading the queue, by the way. So yeah, we're not setting this up.
So we have a question from Vasuki Shastri about the economic team. So speaking of people around Jokowi who don't necessarily always seem to have a lot of clout, right? We have Sri Mulyani, we have a generally competent economic team. Vasuki asks, why has Jokowi still failed to invigorate economic growth with that team in place? Is it a lack of vision? Is it a lack of political will? How do we explain this?
Well, Indonesia in recent years has been blessed by this cohort of technocrats, chiefly at the finance ministry, also at the central bank, Bank Indonesia, which have really helped to keep the show on the road fiscally. They've helped to maintain all-important trust of foreign investors, given that at any one point, 30 or 40% of Indonesia's government debt is owned by foreigners. So that's a really important relationship to manage to keep currency stability, which is really kind of the be-all and end-all for Indonesia, given the devastating impact and the bitter memories of the Asian financial crisis when the rupiah collapsed overnight. But I think the problem is that those technocrats have never really been empowered to drive deeper economic reforms. They're kind of the accountants, right? If you didn't have them, the whole thing would go to pot. But they're not really empowered to drive change across the wider organization. And I think that's a misconception a lot of people have, because Sri Mulyani Indrawati, the finance minister and former number 2 at the World Bank, she's a really impressive leader. She really knows what she's doing and she gives people a lot of confidence. But I don't think she necessarily always has Jokowi's ear. And that's partly the way he manages things. And again, comes partly down to his instinctive way of doing things and his focus on retail politics. So if you look at the infrastructure program, he has increased spending, but it's really been driven sometimes by where he's going next. He wants to be seen there with a shovel, hard hat, and a high visibility vest opening something. But building roads in Papua or the far Sulawesi, it might look good politically as sort of idea that you're bringing Indonesia together from the outside. It's not necessarily that effective at driving investment when you're in remote areas. So I think it's partly down to his instinctive way of doing things. But again, I would tie it into this deeper historical issue that Indonesia fundamentally is deeply protectionist as a nation, and there's this deep resistance to economic liberalism because of the colonial legacy. And Jokowi himself reflects that. So he's been very contradictory. On the one hand, whenever he goes to the World Economic Forum or APEC, or he goes to Washington or Western capitals, he talks about attracting foreign investment, making the Indonesian economy more open and competitive. But when he's speaking domestically, he talks about reducing imports, kicking foreign companies out, helping Indonesia stand on its own 2 feet. And this isn't just loose talk, because he's actually embarked on a deep program to increase the role of Indonesia's state-owned enterprises and to nationalize key oil and gas and mining projects. So he has, on the one hand, he's pushing this kind of statist view. On the other hand, he's saying we want to open up to foreign investment. And it's partly confusion and partly sort of just instinctive politics. But it partly also reflects this resistance to liberalism, but the fact that at the end of the day, Indonesia needs the foreign capital and it needs the foreign technology if it's to grow its economy and create jobs for the something like 3 million young Indonesians who are entering the workforce every year.
So we have 2 questions about the omnibus bill that I'm going to roll together, and you can take whichever parts of it you want. So one from Wayne Forrest with the Indonesia American Chamber of Commerce, and the other from Salsa Putri Satswana Sihombing from Indonesia. Generally, what do you think of the omnibus bill? And I think what both are getting at is, what does this say about the relationship between Jokowi and the DPR, the People's Representative Council, and how much influence was there in the creation of the bill? And 2, Wayne particularly asked, what does this say about the policy infrastructure within the Jokowi administration? Has he ever considered what Wayne calls a West Wing infrastructure, right? I suppose a more competent institutional way to get this out? Or is this a reflection of, as you said, the kind of personality-based policymaking he has?
Well, to be clear, I haven't read the whole thing, and which whole thing, because there are
which of the 4?
There are various different versions circulating around. But the broader point to understand, I think, is that actually the law in Indonesia is always a moving target. And even whatever's in the omnibus bill, so much will depend on not just the implementing regulations from the president and from the ministries, but then how those implementing regulations in practice are upheld. And I think there's always this hope from foreign investors that Indonesia can have some sort of big bang reform, and then you can just sit back, do your investment, get your permit, and get on with it. But it's never going to be that way, I think, anytime soon. So you're always going to have to manage these competing ministries, the competing interests between the central and local levels of government, Indonesian partners and potentially rivals who are trying to screw you over at various times. So I think that messy picture will remain. I mean, obviously the idea of the Omnibus Bill was to clarify certain things, but I'm not sure it has succeeded in that yet. And as I said, much will depend on how it's implemented later. But I think you have to be a bit concerned because, as the questioner was alluding to, Jokowi has this instinctive way of doing things. This bill was really rushed through Parliament, and lots of different interest groups in this very big coalition that Jokowi has were just throwing in things that benefited them or people close to them or their friends. And so there's so many different things. There's been I think a sovereign wealth fund that Indonesia is creating, which isn't a sovereign wealth fund because it's not based on Indonesia's sovereign wealth, but some sort of investment fund that's come out of this. So many different things are going to emerge potentially in the next few months. So I think it's very confusing, and you have to question if it's going to help with the ultimate goal of making things more straightforward for foreign investors. But I guess what's more concerning to me in a sense is kind of the political side of this. So we've seen these really big protests against the Omnibus Law across Indonesia, not just in Jakarta. We've seen students, human rights activists, also labor unions protesting against this for various different reasons. And Jokowi sort of blamed that on, bad communication or even disinformation and hoaxes. But you have to question the politics of this, because part of this is about reducing Indonesia's very onerous severance payments. And while that's maybe the right thing to do technically, doing that in the middle of a pandemic, when millions of Indonesians have lost their jobs, tens of millions more in the informal sector are having their income squeezed, is really kind of questionable politically. And it's not going to lead to any kind of stimulus for the economy, because these sorts of structural reforms will take a long time to have any effect, if they're even successful. And a smarter thing to do would have been to have some sort of bailout focused on more social protection, cash for Indonesians who really need it now. So I think the politics of it hasn't been handled very well. And then there's this broader question of whether it's even going to be effective. So for those reasons, I think we have to kind of hold our judgment, but it doesn't look like it's been very well managed yet, or that it's likely to have the sort of impact that some people will hope for. And I think this does speak to one of the weaknesses of Jokowi's approach, that having all these competing interests, it does protect him in a sense, because he can have this direct connection with the people and blame everything on the ministers. But on the other hand, it doesn't lead to very clear policy making. And without that, I don't think you're going to get the wins you want from foreign investors.
So let's talk about some of the other perceived compromises of the Jokowi administration. So one that I think really rang alarm bells in the US and elsewhere was the KPK revision law. So Gibson Haynes from CIPES, as an ostensible supporter of the KPK, how did Jokowi end up supporting a law that, from the perspective of many, basically gutted the most popular organization, the most popular institution in the country?
I think this gets back to what you were talking about earlier, that Jokowi himself, he did win this anti-corruption award in solo, and he did have a focus on, trying to stop people having to pay bribes for basic things like, getting a driving license or a building permit. But that was really, I think, about driving efficiency. It wasn't necessarily a sense of deeper governance reforms, because I think he views everything in a very practical way as a former furniture maker. So I suspect he started to see the Anti-Corruption Commission as a bit of an impediment to economic development, because there was definitely a sense, and I'm not sure if this is just an excuse, but you definitely talk to people in Indonesia's state-owned enterprises, government ministries, and local officials who said they were scared to take decisions or spend money because they might be accused of corruption. So there's a sense in which I suspect he and maybe some of those around him thought the KPK has become too powerful, and it was kind kind of clogging up the potential to drive infrastructure development and economic growth. But more importantly, I think we know the key political parties have been pushing for a long time to take power off the KPK, simply because so many senior politicians, senior judges, ministers had been thrown in jail for corruption in the past, that they were desperate to undermine its powers. And, how did Jokowi amass this huge coalition of 75% of the parliament? Well, partly that's by giving them what they want. And I think that the push back against the KPK was part of that. So I think for him, it's this very kind of practical way of looking at things. So partly about, trying to stop too much anti-corruption, clogging up economic development, partly about compromise with the political powers that be, and partly because I think he was never really interested in sort of anti-corruption in terms of like governance reform and deeper structural change in society.
So one of the other images that was maybe projected onto Jokowi, right, was this secular figure, right, the great unifier of secular political forces within Indonesia, which fell apart in the 2019 election. Alistair Scarr from Bank of America asked if you could comment on the rise of political Islam and game out how you think this trend evolves in Indonesian politics moving forward.
Well, I don't mean to keep going back to history, but I was trained as a historian. Again, I think this speaks to one of the great contradictions of Indonesia as a nation, right? That it's one of the very few Muslim majority nations in the world without any Islam in its constitution. And at the foundation of Indonesia in 1945 and afterwards in the early years, there were these big debates. Should Indonesia have Sharia Islamic law in the constitution? And they ended up on this messy, in a sense, but quite successful compromise that Indonesia would be a religious state. It's often said that it's secular. That's not true. That's false. Indonesia is a religious state with 6 official religions, of which Islam is one. And it was a compromise. It's kind of held, but it's been tested by rebellions, by uprisings, by coups, by mass movements, by political parties many times over the years. I mean, my own view is that, the pressures of the last few years have been concerning, but in the bigger picture, actually, it's not that big a deal, I would have to say. And if you look in the post-Reformasi era, the broadly Islamic aligned political parties have never really got more than 30% of the seats in parliament. So the kind of explicit sort of pro-Islamic political constituency isn't that big, but it's very confusing in Indonesia because sometimes the supposedly nationalist or non-Islamic secular, sometimes mistakenly called parties, they're often the ones promoting Sharia regulations at a local level. So it is a messy picture. And I think Jokowi is just a practical guy who saw, that with the anti-Ahok campaign, which was really also a proxy battle against him, that he was under pressure. Particularly a lot of the security figures around him were concerned about this sort of radical social movement. And so they looked to kind of the old playbook, the New Order Suharto era playbook of, on the one hand, coercion, so using the law to go after some of the hardliners, and on the other hand, co-optation. So that's why Jokowi appointed Ma'ruf Amin, who'd actually been a key witness in the blasphemy trial of Ahok and a key figure sort of helping to generate all this heat on the streets against Ahok and by proxy Jokowi. But by bringing him into his tent, Jokowi kind of neutralized some of that criticism he helped get over the line in the 2019 election. So quite a contradictory figure because he's willing to make these compromises at the same time. Some of the closest partners he's had in politics have been Christians. So his vice mayor in Solo was a Christian. In fact, Jokowi got the job, or at least the nomination to be the PDIP candidate because their chief guy was a Christian. They needed a Muslim umbrella figure, and so they brought in Jokowi as their mayoral candidate in 2005. Ahok, of course, a ethnic Chinese Christian, and Luhut Pandjaitan as well, who's maybe the closest thing to a real number 2, also a Christian. So Jokowi himself, I think, does embody that sense of pluralism in Indonesia, but he's just willing to make political compromises. He's an ultimate survivor, and he'll do what it takes to stay in power. And we have to remember Ahok, he did get basically flung out of power. He lost the election, but he was also jailed for 2 years. He's now been kind of semi-rehabilitated as the chairman of the national oil monopoly. So there is always a way back in Indonesia, and I don't think it's a simple story of kind of the Islamists on the march taking over.
We have 2 questions, one from Cyrus Policarpio and the other from Lex Riefel at Stimson, asking about Jokowi's approach to Papua. And so I'm old enough to remember when Jokowi ran the first time and pledged to set up a second capital in Jayapura, and that he was going to be the president that finally ended human rights abuses in Papua. And that seems to have been forgotten along the way too. How do we explain that?
Well, to be fair, Jokowi has, I think, spent more time in Papua than almost any other Indonesian president in recent times. He has done a lot, but it's been through his way of doing things. So basically infrastructure development and letting the security forces do their own thing, which is really kind of a continuation, if you like, of what previous Indonesian governments have done. So it's this effort to try and buy off effectively some of the population, or at least deal with some of the economic dissatisfactions through driving development. The problem obviously is often that benefits already wealthy players, whether they are ethnic Papuans or business people from the rest of Indonesia. So push that development, but also kind of keep a hard line on the security forces when there are protests, when there is insurgent activity. So I think effectively it's been the same tactics, but he has put in more effort on the ground. I just think he hasn't done anything differently, and I don't think he really sees it or even thinks about it as a question of kind of dealing with the structural racism in Papua, dealing with the structural inequality and the structural injustice. And so that's why we've seen kind of the security issues and the unhappiness just simmering on, despite the fact that he has put effort in. But we have to acknowledge at the same time, Jokowi's been a big vote winner in Papua. And more generally, again, going back to this previous question, I think in the last election, he won something like 97% of the non-Muslim votes across Indonesia, which is quite incredible. But at the end of the day, I think he's in Papua, it's basically the same approach, but with a bit more goodwill.
So let me combine two questions here. One from Lex again at Stimson, the other from Dr. Wuling Chong from the University of Malaya. Both asked about how, Dr. Chong specifically asked about how COVID-19 is going to affect the political prospects of PDIP, given the perceived failures of the government. And Lex asked about the political future of Anies Baswedan, who is now the governor of Jakarta, and I think is seen largely as the only competent manager of COVID-19 right now in Indonesia. What do you think of Anies and Gerindra's future prospects versus PDIP, and do you think COVID's changed the landscape?
Well, remarkably, it doesn't seem to have had much effect. I mean, if you talk to Indonesian epidemiologists and doctors, they're really unhappy with the way the government is handling, or they would say mishandling the pandemic. But if you look at the polls, Jokowi remains remarkably popular, and partly, I think, because he's got so much political support in the parliament, but also most of the key media owners and other tycoons are really behind his government. There isn't really much concerted political or media opposition. I think the Jakarta Post and some other Tempo magazine have been very critical of his management of COVID, but they're pretty niche publications. And Jokowi's approval ratings still remain in the kind of high 60% levels. They're not really changed by COVID. And people actually seem to agree with his approach of sort of putting the economy first. This sense that if you do too much to try and deal with the health issues, people won't be able to work if their movement is restricted, and they'll basically starve. So I think he's actually been quite effective at maintaining public support, despite what seems to be the mishandling of the pandemic. So that's really interesting, I think, on the one hand. I think in terms of others, Anies Baswedan, I think by some seem to have done a good job. Some of the other local leaders too, like Ridwan Kamil, the governor of West Java, Indonesia's biggest province, former architect trained, I think, at Berkeley or one of the top quality US universities. I mean, he's a really smart guy. He's also been kind of playing the politics quite well. He volunteered for the vaccination trial, which is underway in Indonesia himself, personally. So there are a few other leaders who seem to have done a better job of handling things. But it's hard to know, what the constellation is going to be for 2024. So much can change. And I suspect this kind of consensus behind Jokowi will start to break down as 2024 nears, and different parties and individuals and media owners and the like look to different people to fight it out. So I think we'll see that break down. But Anies is a fascinating figure. He again was a Jokowi advisor back in the day. I remember talking to him about, he was telling me how great Jokowi was and he would transform everything. Jokowi very soon fell out with him when he was education minister, sacked him. One of the few times Jokowi has kind of explicitly kicked someone out of office, Anis was pretty upset. And Jokowi ended up creating this powerful enemy because Anis was really one of the figures who crystallized the opposition to Ahok and by proxy Jokowi. So again, fascinating there. You've seen Prabowo kind of kiss and make up with Jokowi. Anis kind of has gone the other way. He was there with Jokowi and now he seems to be this big potential rival. But I think it's just too far out to know how the coalitions are going to break down for 2024.
Let's close out with a couple questions on foreign policy, right? That's our bailiwick. So Aaron Aristotle asked a pretty open-ended question, right, which is that the name of the book or subtitle of the book is Man of Contradiction. Do you think that applies to Jokowi's foreign policy choices? Have you seen indications that his administration has flip-flopped, whatever that means, on foreign policy issues?
Well, I think that the key tension in the foreign policy is that, as I said earlier, it's basically been very mercantilist, but and at the same time, certain people around Jokowi did pitch this idea of a global maritime fulcrum, that Indonesia would kind of step up in the region, particularly as a maritime player and a sort of diplomatic actor, sort of finally taking this role that people in Washington and in Canberra have been waiting so long for it to do. But none of that has really materialized. So I think there is a contradiction there between this ambition, but I don't think. Obviously Jokowi has spoken about it sometimes, but I don't think it ever really seemed to be him when he was talking about it. So I think we've really seen him kind of do what you'd expect, which is to have this very practical foreign policy focused on avoiding problems and attracting investment and finding new markets for Indonesia's products. But there's certainly been many of contradictions in terms of things he's said. He's instinctive. He responds to events. And I remember when he went to Washington a few years back to meet Barack Obama, he said, Indonesia wants to join the TPP, even though Indonesia traditionally very, very protectionist. That never went anywhere. And I think a few weeks later, he gave a speech at a conference in Bandung to commemorate the Asia-Africa conference, where he talked about needing to dismantle the kind of Western institutions, the World Bank and the ADB, and have a new, fairer settlement. So I think he's kind of flip-flopped on many things, and I think it's just a reflection. He's not actually that interested in grand foreign policy. He's interested in doing deals, attracting investment. And I think where he has done trade deals, for example, with Australia recently, it's really more about getting more access for Indonesian products to overseas markets than it is about driving deeper economic reform per se.
And let's give the last word to Richard Harris with MITRE, who asked if you could talk a bit about Jokowi's views on ASEAN and whether he views membership as really valuable to Indonesia. You did mention that his first overseas trip was to the EAS in Naypyidaw, I think. And I recall the stories, basically the fact that he had to be dragged kicking and screaming. He didn't understand why he had to waste his time at these summits. Is that still the case?
Well, I think Jokowi's not a great fan of ASEAN meetings, like many of us. But I think he certainly understands, and of course the Indonesian Foreign Ministry most certainly understands the importance of ASEAN and Indonesia's role there. I think he personally doesn't like the stilted format of just reading out statements, and he's not interested in the high diplomacy. But certainly I think we have to acknowledge he's given a lot of space to Retno Marsudi, his foreign minister, to be quite active within ASEAN. So she's pushed this idea of an ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. I personally think it's a pretty vacuous document or set of phrases, but to be fair, it does show that Indonesia wants to be seen to be relevant in the rhetorical debate. And I think he has given Retno Marsudi a bit more room over the years to kind of push within ASEAN, to be quite outspoken within the bounds of Indonesia's desire not to interfere in others' internal affairs on the question of the Rohingya refugees from Myanmar and their treatment. So I think he's allowed her a fair bit of room, but he himself isn't interested. This year, we did see Jokowi address UNGA, the UN General Assembly, for the first time. That was because he could do it via Zoom or whichever video conferencing suite he uses. Before, he could never see the point in flying all the way to New York just to give a speech about, saving the world. So he's really not interested in that kind of stuff. But I do think he instinctively understands the importance of ASEAN, of Indonesia's position there, and he's allowed, the key technocrats within the foreign ministry working on that to have space to uphold Indonesia's position. But I don't think we've really seen an enhancement of Indonesia's leadership within ASEAN. And frankly, talking to friends from Southeast Asia, I think they would say that since the SBY years, Indonesia has been, in general, a bit quieter than it was back then.
Well, thank you. Let's cut it off there. We're almost at time. The last and most important question: where and when can everybody on the call pick up Man of Contradictions?
Well, thanks, Greg. So yeah, it's now currently on sale around the world on all kind of the ebook platforms. So you can get it on Kindle and Apple Books and Google Books. If you want a physical copy, it's available in Australia and on Book Depository globally, but it won't be in the US until the 1st of January. These things tend to move around the world at a bit of a glacial pace in the best of times, and in the middle of a pandemic, it's even worse. So if you want to immediately, get it on the ebook, otherwise Book Depository, or wait until January, and you can ask your local bookstore to order it for you if you don't want to give Jeff Bezos even more money.
Thanks, Ben. We didn't get through the Q&A or even close. So if you have unanswered questions, email or harass Ben on Twitter. I'm sure he'll enjoy it. And with that, thanks a lot. I know it's the middle of the night for you. You've been very generous with your time, and thanks everybody for joining us. Stay safe.